Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Doug Swanson, Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum and the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. On behalf of David Ferriero, Archivist of the United States, I want to welcome you all to the McGowan Theater, located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. Before we hear from Eric Jay Dolin on his new book, Black Flags, Blue Waters, I'd like to mention some of our other programs that are going to be taking place in this location in the near future. Tomorrow evening, November 8th at 7 p.m., there will be a film screening of Blood Road, which follows the journey of Rebecca Rush and her Vietnamese riding partner as they pedal 1,200 miles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Their destination, the crash site and final resting place of Rebecca's father, a U.S. Air Force pilot who was shot down over Laos. The screening is presented in conjunction with our exhibit, Remembering Vietnam. At noon on November 13th, renowned historian and biographer Richard Brookhiser will present an author talk and book signing on his latest book, John Marshall, The Man Who Made the Supreme Court. To find out more about these, our other programs, and our exhibits, please visit our website at www.archives.gov/calendar, and you'll also find some printed materials out in the theater lobby on upcoming events. Our topic for today is Black Flags, Blue Waters, the Epic History of America's Most Notorious Pirates by Eric Jay Dolin. A graduate of Brown, Yale, and MIT, where he received his PhD in environmental policy, Eric Jay Dolin is the award-winning author or co-author of 13 books and over 60 magazine, journal, or newspaper articles. Among his best-selling books are Brilliant Beacons, A History of the American Lighthouse, which was chosen by G Captain and Classic Boat as one of the best nautical books of 2016. Also Leviathan, The History of Whaling in America, which was chosen as one of the best nonfiction books of 2007 by the Los Angeles Times, Boston Globe, and Providence Journal, and also won the 2007 John Lyman Award for U.S. Maritime History. In addition to awards for his books, he's also been a recipient of other honors, including the Switzer Environmental Fellowship, the Dean John A. Naus Marine Policy Fellowship, and the Star Fellowship for Public Service from Brown University. He is also a Nantucket Historical Society Research Fellow and was awarded a special commendation from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for contributing to the award of the Nobel Peace Prize for 2007 to the IPCC. Please join me in welcoming Eric Jay Dolin to the National Archives.
Thank you, Doug, for that wonderful introduction, and thank all of you for coming out today. It's a pleasure to be back at the National Archives again. I used to live in D.C. Actually lived in 3 different locations in D.C. and also in Maryland in a little town called Garrett Park, so this is a bit of a homecoming. Pirates have long been among the most colorful and memorable celebrities in popular culture. Much of this has to do with the impact of books that use pirates as a motif. And the most famous of that, of course, is Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, which was first published in 1883. Stevenson weaves a wonderfully dramatic story of the search for pirate treasure, replete with a map of Skeleton Island on which an X, or actually 3 red crosses of ink, mark the spot where the loot is to be found. Treasure Island is also the book that gave us the familiar sea shanty refrain. Whoops. Sorry, if there's a little bit of confusion, my computer is not synced to that system, so I've got 2 clickers up here going at the same time, so bear with me a little bit. Treasure Island is also the book that gave us the familiar sea shanty refrain, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum. Drink and the devil had done for the rest. Yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, and now you know why I am a writer and not a singer. Movies have also had a major impact on how we view pirates, and most recently, Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean franchise has created a renewed pirate mania. Oops. Sorry. With all these cultural references, it's no wonder then that pirate costumes are among the most popular worn on Halloween night, and international talk like a Pirate Day is observed by legions of fans around the world. There's no denying it, pirates have grabbed hold of our collective imagination. Many have daydreamed of leaving traditional society behind, boarding a ship, and throwing in their lot with the hardy men and women, intent on taking what they want and getting rich, while enjoying the luxurious freedom of sailing the world's oceans with a hold full of rum. Mark Twain captured this longing in his memoir, Life on the Mississippi, when he admitted that even though he and his friends had but one permanent ambition, to be steamboatmen, now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. Historians can certainly poke holes at the fictional representations of pirates, especially those that depict them as unnaturally attractive, rakish yet good-natured rapscallions having a grand old time looking for love, adventure, and treasure on the waves. The reality of piracy is nothing like the breathless musings of a New York Times reporter from 1892 who complained, "It cannot but be a source of regret to every true lover of the picturesque that pirates are no more, and piracy has lost its popularity. What tremendous fellows they must have been. What heroes, dandies, wits were to be found among them. They were immensely superior to land brigands, who are mere milk compared with Blackbeard and Captain Kidd." While real pirates were incredibly intriguing and compelling characters, they most definitely were not tremendous fellows. Instead, they were seaborne criminals who were neither endearing nor heroic. Black Flag's Blue Waters cuts through the Hollywood imagery and the mythology surrounding pirates and reveals a dramatic and surprising history of American piracy's golden age, which spanned from the late 1600s through the early 1700s, when lawless pirates plied the coastal waters of North America and beyond. To give you a better sense of what is in the book, I am going to read a short excerpt from the introduction. The Golden Age was the most dramatic era of maritime marauding the world has ever known. It produced such iconic characters as Captain William Kidd and Blackbeard, along with thousands of other pirates whose names are less familiar, but whose despicable deeds are often just as riveting. Much has been written about that time period, and this book adds to that literary lineage, but with a twist. Rather than focusing broadly on this era, Black Flag's Blue Waters zeroes in on the history of the pirates who either operated out of America's English colonies or plundered ships along the American coast. From the early 1680s to mid-1720s, these pirates had an exceedingly close, often tempestuous, and frequently deadly relationship with the colonies. While this arrangement began with a warm and financially lucrative embrace, it eventually ended in a bloody war against pirates, punctuated by scores of hangings from Boston to Charleston. At its most elemental, Black Flags, Blue Waters is about men acting like oceanic gamblers, playing the risky and sometimes fatal game of preying on merchant ships in search of treasure. Most pirates failed to achieve great financial success and had brief careers that often ended in violent death, but that was not always the case. The book is also a history of intimidation and, at times, extreme brutality. Pirates were almost always able to rely on the threat of force to get what they want, to get their victims to submit without violence. But when that approach failed, pirates were willing to fight for what they coveted. This is likewise a story of political intrigue and collusion. In the late 1600s, many colonists heartily encouraged and supported pirates, though such activities flouted English law. Those colonists viewed pirates not as dangerous raiders, but as commercial angels and as friends and family who enabled the colonies to obtain the goods and money they so desperately desired, despite the onerous trade restrictions put in place by the mother country. Finally, Black Flags, Blue Waters is about crackdowns, punishment, and eradication. Reacting to the growing problem of piracy in the late 1600s, England launched political, legal, and naval initiatives that had considerable success in countering the pirate threat. But in the mid-17-teens, piracy experienced a resurgence, and the number of pirates exploded. More than ever before, they focused their depredations on British ships traveling along the coast of the American colonies, once viewed by many colonists and their official representatives in a favorable light. Pirates were now increasingly viewed as mortal enemies who posed a grave threat to trade. Through a combination of legal, political, and military means, pirates were virtually eliminated by the middle of the 1720s. Many people view pirates in a romantic light, but there was absolutely nothing romantic about them other than the tales and legends woven about their exploits after they were gone. That is not to say that pirates were boring, far from it. While the pirates of Black Flags, Blue Waters can't compete with the magnetic charms and witty repartee of Captain Jack Sparrow, they are compelling characters nonetheless. And the real story of America's pirates is even more astonishing and fascinating than any fictional pirate adventure ever written or cast on the silver screen. Whoops. This is a problem when you're coordinating two clickers. Anyway, people often ask how I come up with the ideas for my books. After I wrote my last book, Brilliant Beacons, A History of the American Lighthouse, I was casting around for a topic. And I decided to try something different. I decided to pitch some ideas to my kids, Lily and Harry, who were teenagers at the time. And I had about 4 or 5 ideas. But when I lighted on the topic of pirates, they both got extremely excited and said, "That's it, you have to write about pirates." They said the reason is because they watched so many pirate movies and they wanted to, read about that if possible. But the reason I got excited is I've written 13 books, and neither of my kids have read any of them. So I knew that if I wrote a book about pirates, I might have a chance to get one of them, or maybe 2 of them, to read the book. And I have to admit that since the book has come out, my daughter, Lily, who's now a senior in college, has read the book, and she gave it a thumbs up. And my son, Harry, who's a freshman in college, has said that he will get to it perhaps by the time that he is 50. So my daughter even threw out a couple of possible titles for the book, including Swords, Sails, and Swashbucklers, and Arg, or Ar, which I had to tell Lily, much to her chagrin, is not a word likely uttered by a Golden Age pirate, but is more a byproduct of Disney and Hollywood in the mid-1900s. When I began working on this book, I knew very little about pirates, but that was by design. I always chose books on topics that I know little about because I want to remain excited for the entire 18 months or 2 years that it takes me to write one of these books. And if I pick a topic I don't know a lot about, that means I'm going to have surprises every couple of weeks, and hopefully that excitement will translate itself to the written page. Now, of course, I had seen a number of movies with a pirate theme, including all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, as well as Muppets Treasure Island, The Goonies, Hook, and even The Princess Bride with its repeated references to the dread pirate Roberts. But I hadn't read any books about pirates, not even Treasure Island. I knew what pirates dreamed about: the big score, capturing a ship with a hold full of Spanish silver dollars or pieces of 8 and gold doubloons. Whoops. I had heard of Blackbeard, but I really didn't know much about him, other than the obvious fact that he had a black beard. I had also heard of Captain Kidd, but the only thing I knew about him was that he supposedly buried treasure up and down the East Coast, from Delaware to Oak Island, Nova Scotia. Of course, that is a total myth, but it hasn't stopped many people over the years from spending significant amounts of time and money searching for Captain Kidd's hidden treasure, but coming up empty. I had also heard that pirates drank a lot, especially rum, which qualified as the pirate's drink of choice. And maybe you'll be happy to know that that fact is, in fact, 100% true. One pirate even admitted that the love of drink and a lazy life were stronger motives than gold in drawing him into piracy. The more I learned about pirates, however, the more fascinated I became. Pirates were an important part of American history, and their story was far more complicated and intriguing than I had suspected. The first known instance of piracy along the American coast took place in the summer of 1632, when a pirate named Dixie Bull and his men plundered a few English merchant ships and then disappeared from sight. Other than that, the main connection that the piracy had with that the colonies had with piracy during the mid-1800s or 1600s was twofold. First, many American merchants traveled to the Caribbean to sell pirates' goods, and in turn, many pirates came up from the Caribbean and settled in the colonies with their money. In 1684, for example, Jamaican Governor Sir Thomas Lynch noted that the northern colonies are now full of pirates' money. Pirates had, Lynch claimed, carried the equivalent of 80,000 pounds sterling into Boston alone, a city that one English official labeled as the common receptacle of pirates of all nations. Does anybody know who this is? He has a type of rum named after him. Henry Morgan. The mid-1600s is also the era of the Buccaneers, such as Henry Morgan, who roamed the Caribbean in search of Spanish treasure ships to plunder. The treasure ships were full of silver and gold that came from the mines in Central and South America. The most productive mint was established in 1575 in the city of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia, at the foot of what the Spanish called Cerro Rico, or Rich Mountain. The mints of Potosi in Mexico produced copious quantities of coins, including gleaming gold doubloons and, most importantly, 8 real coins, those so-called pieces of 8, or Spanish silver dollars, which became the first truly global currency. The Buccaneers' favorite haunt was on the island of Jamaica in the city of Port Royal. It's in the southwestern corner of Jamaica. Arguably the wealthiest English city in the New World in 1680, Port Royal's veneer of sophistication could not hide its decidedly sleazy underbelly. This is when Port Royal gained the well-earned reputation as the wickedest city on earth and the Sodom of the West Indies. An unsavory melange of buccaneers and privateers prowled Port Royal's streets and alleyways in search of liquid and carnal pleasure. As one buccaneer said of his peers, whenever they've got hold of something, they don't keep it for long. They're busy dicing, whoring, and drinking, so long as they have anything to spend. Some of them will get through a good 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in a day, and the next day not have a shirt on their back. He continued, my own master used to buy a butt of wine and set it in the middle of the street with the barrel head knocked in and stand barring the way. Every passer-by had to drink with him, or he'd have shot them dead with the gun that he kept handy. I often thought that would be a very effective way to sell my books at my talks. On June 7, 1692, a devastating earthquake struck Jamaica. When it was all over, nearly 2/3 of the landmass of Port Royal had sunk beneath the waves, and almost 5,000 people died, including many buccaneers. In the gruesome aftermath, hundreds of dead and bloated bodies could be seen floating on the harbor and washed up on shore. A local minister who survived called the earthquake a terrible judgment of God. that was brought down upon the heads of the most ungodly, debauched people in the world. By the late 1600s, buccaneers had been largely replaced by the Red Sea men who came from the colonies, went around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, where they attacked Mughal or Muslim ships from India, traveling between India and the Red Sea ports of Jeddah and Mocha. On the surface, the Red Sea men appeared to be nothing more than privateers. For a fee, they had been issued privateering licenses or letters of marque by colonial governors, which gave them permission to attack French ships, since at the time England and France were at war. But these governors knew full well that the Red Sea men had no intention of fighting the French, but instead were heading to the Indian Ocean to plunder Mughal ships. The Red Sea men were the most successful of all pirates, with some of them, such as Henry Avery here, amassing considerable fortunes. Avery's greatest success was capturing the Ganja Saway, which was owned by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. The pirates plundered the ship for several days, and when they weren't gathering loot, they engaged in an animalistic and vile orgy, viciously raping numerous women. A few of the intended victims, unable to bear the humiliation of having their families and friends see them ravished and defiled, killed themselves with daggers or jumped into the ocean to their death. Despite this horrible behavior, the Red Sea men were welcomed with open arms in the American colonies, because they were, in many cases, accepted and much beloved members of the colonies from which they sailed. They were the sons, fathers, and brothers who chose to better their lives and the lives of their families by robbing quote-unquote infidels halfway around the world and bringing much-needed silver and gold back to the colonies. While in the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea men used the island of Sainte Marie off the larger island of Madagascar, it's that little green island in the upper, almost right-hand corner, as their home base. There was plenty of gambling on the island. During a single toss of the die, a pirate from New York earned 1,300 pieces of 8. There were also plenty of fights. In one case, 14 men who were desperately disappointed with the amount of wealth that they brought back from their most recent voyage decided to square off 7 on a side and fight to the death. At the end of the battle, 7 of them were slain on one side, and 5 of the 7 on the other were killed. The last 2 decided to just split the money. Although the Red Sea men were welcomed in the colonies, the British Parliament and the Crown despised them. Not only did pirates break the law, but they also threatened the entire East Indian trade, which was so vital to the British economy. The resulting crackdown on pirates used a combination of stricter laws, more effective prosecutions, naval attacks on pirate ships, and increased hangings to greatly reduce the pirate threat in the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean by the middle of the 1700s. Whoops. Once again, I screwed up on the syncing. Sorry about that. The general reprieve from piracy continued for the duration of the War of the Spanish Succession between 1702 and 1713. The only significant case of piracy in the colonies during the war involved Captain Quelch, John Quelch, who left from my hometown of Marblehead, Massachusetts. He and his men were on a privateer. They killed the captain, pitched him over the side, went down to Brazil, plundered a bunch of ships, came back with 10,000 pounds worth of gold dust. Quelch and part of his gang were caught after returning to Marblehead in 1704. And on June 30th of 1704, they were hanged on the edge of Boston Harbor. Thousands of people came out to watch them swing into eternity, including this gentleman, Puritan preacher Cotton Mather. He stood up and steadied himself on a boat just offshore to begin his sermon. "We the ministers have told you often, yea, we have told you weeping, that you have by sin undone yourselves. We have shown you how to commit yourself into his saving and healing hands, and how to express repentance. We can do no more but leave you in his merciful hands." When the scaffold platform was pulled away and the men fell to their death, the screams of the crowd were so loud that they were heard more than a mile away. A few years after the end of the war, piracy came roaring back. inaugurating the second major period of American piracy, which lasted from 1715 to 1726, when as many as 4,000 pirates were active. And this time, the major focus of activity was not the Red Sea, but rather the coastal waters off the American colonies, as well as the Caribbean. There are many reasons for the explosion in piracy during this period. A significant number of Navy men and privateers who were thrown out of work at the end of the War of Spanish Succession turned to piracy. Other men who didn't like their despotic captains rose up and mutinied, and they turned to piracy as well. And then there was the wreck of a Spanish treasure fleet not far from Vero Beach, Florida. When people heard about this wreck and all the gold that was scattered on the ocean floor, hundreds and thousands of would-be pirate seekers came down to Florida, dove on the wrecks. Only a few of them found any riches, but whether they did or not, many of them stayed in the Caribbean and adopted the pirate life. Although many men voluntarily signed on to become pirates, others were forced to go on the account, becoming pirates against their will. 1715 to 1726 is also the period when pirates used the Black Flag, or the Jolly Roger, as their terrifying calling card. The Black Flag was intended to strike fear into the hearts of sailors who spied it fluttering atop the masts of the pirate ship, sending the unmistakable message, surrender immediately or else we'll attack. Being risk-averse, pirates always hoped for surrender. They never wanted to fight if they could avoid it, because there was no upside to battle. Fortunately for the pirates, they rarely had to resort to force, since intimidation, courtesy of the Black Flag, worked so well. This is when pirates voted in democratic fashion to determine who would be their pirate captain, where they would go to hunt for prizes, and which ships they would attack. This is when pirates signed the Articles of Agreement, or the Pirate Code, which laid out the rules of their behavior and also mandated the virtually even distribution of treasure among the crew. This is when many black men served as pirates. A significant number of them were African slaves who continued to be slaves on board the pirate ship and were later resold. But that's not the entire story. Many black pirates became valued crew members who fought alongside their white pirate brethren and shared in the spoils. This is when Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the only two women known to have fought on pirate ships in the Atlantic during the Golden Age, appeared briefly on history's stage. Both were put on trial in Port Royal as part of Calico Jack Rackham's pirate crew. Bonny also happened to be Rackham's lover. Their trials in Jamaica are not only memorable for the multiple hangings that ensued, but also for the unusual legal gambit employed by Bonny and Read. The court found them guilty of piracy and they were condemned to be hanged. Immediately after that sentence was handed down, however, the two women informed or pleaded their bellies, informing the court that they were pregnant. And when the court determined that this was, in fact, the case, it gave them both a temporary stay of execution. On the day that Rackham went to the gallows, Bonny made it clear that she was very disappointed in her erstwhile lover, saying that she was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. As for the ladies, Read died in jail from an unspecified illness soon thereafter, and Bonny simply disappeared from the historical record. This is when Edward Thatch, better known as Blackbeard, and 400 of his men blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, and terrified the rest of the coast with their exploits. Blackbeard met his grisly end at the hands of British Naval Lieutenant Robert Maynard, whose forces battled him and his men off Ocracoke Island in North Carolina. After the battle was over, Maynard severed Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop. Blackbeard's headless body was pitched into the murky waters of Pamlico Sound, where, according to legend, it took a few laps around the sloop before sinking from sight. Blackbeard's story has recently come full circle. In 1996, in the shallow waters of Beaufort Inlet, they discovered Blackbeard's flagship, or the remains of Blackbeard's flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and started recovering artifacts, including this cannon. This period is also when Stede Bonnet, a wealthy sugar plantation owner from Barbados, decided to give up his comfortable life and become a pirate, or the gentleman pirate as he is often called. He even built his own pirate ship and had the captain's cabin lined with shelves so that he could bring along his own personal library. It's not clear why Bonnet took the dramatic action of becoming a pirate. Some have pointed to depression, perhaps insanity, while others have traced its origins to some discomforts that he found in married life. Must have been a bad marriage. On his own, in a league with Blackbeard, Bonnet had some success along with many failures. He was finally captured in late September 1718 when Colonel William Rhett's forces came upon Bonnet and his men near the mouth of the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. The trial of Bonnet and his men, held in Charleston, South Carolina, was a sensational affair. Not only did Bonnet and one of his men escape, only to be recaptured a few days later, but also some of Bonnet's supporters in town threatened to burn down Charleston if he wasn't released, but the court didn't succumb to such pressure. They tried him, found him guilty, and hanged him and his men along the edge of the harbor. This is also when pirate Sam Bellamy captured a British slave ship called the Widow, which was carrying a fortune in gold and silver, the proceeds from selling 500 slaves in Port Royal. Adding to Bellamy's riches was all the booty that he and his men had gotten from raiding more than 50 ships just in the prior year. However, they wouldn't be able to enjoy the spoils of their success because in April 1717, when they were sailing by the outstretched arm of Cape Cod, a nor'easter came blowing down the coast, sank the Widow, killed 161 men on board, and all of that treasure went to the bottom, only about 1,500 feet from shore. For 267 years, the Widow's treasure remained buried beneath the waves, until 1984, when salvager and diver Barry Clifford and his team found the Widow and began recovering its treasure. The item that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that all these artifacts came from the Widow was the ship's bell, which is shown here. Now, Clifford and his men had made history. They became the first people ever to find an authenticated pirate ship and treasure. How much the recovered treasure is worth is a subject of debate. There are estimates that range from an unreasonably low $200,000 to an improbably high $400 million. Now, I've been doing a lot of radio interviews lately, and people ask me who my favorite pirate is. And that's really, I have to rephrase the question. I don't have a favorite pirate. They're all pretty miserable people, but there are some pirates that are more fascinating than others, and certainly this gentleman, Edward Lowe, one of the most despicable and arguably mentally deranged pirates ever to sail the sea, was definitely fascinating in a morbid kind of way. He seemed to relish torturing and killing his victims. One of his signature moves was cutting off people's ears and lips, roasting them, and then forcing the victim to eat their own flesh. When I recounted that on one radio interview, the interviewer said to me, "You're a little too animated when telling me that story. A little worried about you." Another time when Lowe captured a ship where the captain had the temerity to cut the bag holding gold and silver so that the bag fell into the ocean instead of into Lowe's hands. Lowe killed the captain and all 32 of his crew. Another time when Lowe seized casks of wine and brandy from a captured vessel, its captain asked Lowe if he would be so kind as to write a sentence or two stating that he had taken the liquor so that the owner wouldn't think that the captain had illegally sold it and pocketed the profits. Lowe cheerily agreed, and a few minutes later he came back with 2 loaded pistols, and presenting one at the captain's bowels, he told the petrified man that this was for his wine and discharged it. And then he pointed the other pistol at the captain's head, saying, "This one is for your brandy," and fired. Lowe is also the pirate who forced a Marblehead fisherman named Philip Ashton to become a pirate himself. But then a few months later, Ashton escaped from Lowe's clutches, and he landed on this uninhabited island in the Bay of Honduras, Roatan, and he stayed there for almost 2 years, most of it completely alone, before he was picked up by a brigantine from Salem and returned to Marblehead. After returning to Marblehead, his saga of suffering and endurance was a huge story in New England, in large part because it happened in the mid-1720s, just a few years after Daniel Defoe wrote the wildly popular Robinson Crusoe, and Ashton was America's real-life Robinson Crusoe. Now, here's one of the myths that is most persistent about pirates, that they walk the plank. There is not a single instance of any Golden Age pirate forcing a victim to walk the plank. Why would they? There are plenty of easier ways to kill people. You can run them through with a cutlass, you can shoot them, or you could pitch them over the side of the ship. Now, this second and very bloody period of piracy came to an end in the mid-1720s, when the number of pirates plummeted to an insignificant level. Of the many factors contributing to this decline, one was colonial resolve to fight piracy at land and at sea, which resulted in numerous pirates being killed in battle or hanged on land. At well-publicized trials in Boston, Williamsburg, Charleston, and Newport, colonial officials condemned 68 men to the gallows. Another critical determinant was Britain's increased efforts to eliminate pirates throughout the Atlantic, using a combination of pardons, stricter laws, naval force, executions, and the eradication of the famous pirate stronghold at Nassau on New Providence in the Bahamas. Now, the last of the pirates to be hanged during this period was Captain William Fly and his men, who had attacked a number of merchant ships along the American coast, but then they had too many prisoners on board. Some of those prisoners rose up, killed some of the pirates, brought the remainder into Boston, where they were tried in Admiralty Court, found guilty, and then they were hanged on the edge of Boston Harbor in July of 1726. After the hangings, the dead men were rowed out to a small island in Boston Harbor, where Fly's associates were buried. But according to the local paper, Fly was hung up in irons as a spectacle for the warning of others, especially seafaring men. The warning was hardly necessary. Fly's spectacular, bloody, and brief piratical campaign was the last gasp of the golden age of piracy, and that is where this book ends as well. The pirates depicted in Black Flag's Blue Waters blazed a fiery and unforgettable path through the history of colonial America. For centuries, their turbulent, destructive, and fascinating lives have beguiled, horrified, and entertained us, leaving an indelible and unique mark on our culture. Undoubtedly, there will be more pirate movies, books, and television shows in the future, many of which will perpetuate myths or create them anew. But in the end, there is no need to embellish the history of these pirates, for what they actually did was amazing enough. And I just have one more slide. After I finished my last book, Brilliant Beacons, on lighthouses, my daughter, who's a very good artist, painted a large painting of a lighthouse, and she gave it to me near the end of my work, saying that it was meant to be an incentive to have me finish the book faster. So I hung it in my office, and I finished the book. So when this book was done, and my daughter was home from college, I decided we were going to start a tradition. And every book I write from now on is going to have one of your paintings in it. So in the afternoon, she got out a little 3x4-inch board, and she painted this painting and handed it to me and said, "Dad, this is a pirate ship looking for its next victim. And if you see the book, it is the final picture in the color insert." I don't know what she's going to paint for my next book, which is on hurricanes, but I'm sure she'll figure out something. And with that, I am done, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. I've never had to master two clickers at once, so I apologize for the rough edges on this talk. But thank you very much for coming. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I enjoy seeing you back here. I was here when you did the Lighthouse, so it's good to see a second book and look forward to your next book. Curious why 1680, in your thoughts, speculation-wise, is the catalyst, since there was trade prior to that with the Spanish, and there must have been pirates from 1492 on. Also, we always see the ships, but where are the ships coming from? I've got one ship, I then can get another ship and another ship, but these ships have to be, as you said, one pirate made their own ships. How did they proceed to get ships and continue to get all those? And if they did, it kind of like the Wild West when someone steals somebody's horse. That's my horse. You can see that there's a marking on it, or there's some marking on these ships to say that this is my word against yours, that I own this or you own this. Anything from that perspective on how pirate ships just can continue to be there, but why are they there?
Okay, as for 1680, it's a little bit of an artificial date. I could have gone back a few years, but my book focuses on the pirates that left from America's shores or plundered ships along the American coast. And right about 1680, there were a lot of pirates coming up from the Caribbean, resettling in the colonies, and then a few years later, they became Red Sea men, or they were plundering ships along the American coast. The 1720s is just the end. It's when pirates sort of almost vanished for a while. They came back. They were pirates, as you know, still to this day. As for what happens to a pirate ship, once you own a pirate ship and you're a pirate, you're not about to give it up. They would start, some of them would start with a small rowboat and they'd work their way up to a larger ship. Other pirates mutinied, so the ship they were on became their pirate ship. So yes, somebody could have determined that a pirate crew was on a ship that was owned by somebody else. That went without saying, but that didn't mean that you could get it back. You know, it's sort of like finders keepers, but in a illegal sense. Once the pirates commandeered that ship, that was their pirate ship until they faded from history or they were attacked and beaten. So it didn't matter if somebody knew, oh, that's Joe's merchant ship. Once that pirate has it, they've got it until somebody can wrest it from their control.
I'd like to know a little bit more about Captain Kidd and where he fits in this. I admit it's because if you go back enough greats, he was an uncle.
Oh, okay. Well, Captain Kidd, some people think Captain Kidd was just a pure privateer. Other people think that he was a minor pirate. I fall into the second camp. He had 2 privateering licenses, one of which allowed him go into the Indian Ocean and attack pirate ships. Another one allowed him to go into the Indian Ocean and attack and take French ships, since it was King William's War and France and England were at war. What happened to Kidd, in my estimation, is once he got into the Indian Ocean, he was having no luck on either accord. Most of the men on board his ship who he had recruited in New York were former pirates or privateers. They were getting restless. There was a dangerous interplay, and he took advantage of that to some extent and plundered 3 or 4 different ships beyond the 2 ships that he caught that had French passes. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated. There's a big section in the book about it. But when he was tried in England, he claimed that 2 of the ships that he got were legal captures because they had French passes. He gave those passes to the governor of New York. Somehow, mysteriously, they disappeared before the trial. If he had had those passes, he might have gotten off on those charges. But there was incontrovertible evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that he had plundered, either himself or his men, 3 or 4 other ships along the way. Plus, he was also convicted of murder of one of the men on board. So it is a very complicated story. There are entire books written on Captain Kidd. I think it's great that you have him as an ancestor, whether he's a bad guy or a good guy. It's fascinating. But he wasn't a very good pirate. And the reason that he became so famous, he wasn't particularly successful by any measure. But I think the reason that Captain Kidd became so famous was because of the stories started at the time when he was alive, that he had gathered hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of treasure, and that he had somehow buried it. And that legend began almost right then and there, because the governor of New York was very upset when he came back and realized that Captain Kidd only had about $10,000 or $14,000 worth of treasure, because prior to him coming back to Boston, the word was on the street or on the ocean was that Captain Kidd had upwards of $400,000 or $500,000 worth of treasure. So this started a mini cottage industry of trying to figure out what happened to all that treasure that Captain Kidd supposedly had. And to this day, there's even a TV show, I haven't seen it, about Oak Island, where they're trying to find Captain Kidd's part of his hoard up in Oak Island, Nova Scotia. And I just saw that there's a book that just came out about the Oak Island obsession. So Captain Kidd, it's a fascinating story. It's in the book. A good friend of mine, Richard Zacks, claims that Captain Kidd was framed by the authorities and he wasn't a pirate at all. I disagree a little bit.
What period is he?
He's from the mid-16, well, he was a privateer, Buccaneer before, but what I talk about when he went off as under the aegis of the British government, it was, or the English government at the time, it was the mid-1690s to about 1701 when he was finally hanged. And unfortunately for him, I mean, being hanged is no good whenever it happens. But he was hanged, and the first time the rope broke. So he was rip-roaring drunk, and he fell down, hit the ground, and sort of knocked the senses into him. But then, unfortunately, they tied him up again, and the second time the rope held, and he went off into eternity. Sure.
My question, did pirates have extra flags and like raise the incorrect one till they could get close to their prey and then raise the Jolly Roger? Because I'd heard privateers did that, so they'd have like a collection of all the merchant countries' flags on them.
Yes, absolutely. Pirates did that. Privateers did that. Naval ships sometimes did that. A good way on the ocean of luring somebody in close is if you know it's a French ship on the horizon, and they could be putting up a false flag as well. But let's say that you think it's a French ship. You go into your little collection, you take out your French ensign, you raise it up the main mast, you get in close, and then if you're a pirate and you want to attack, you raise your black flag. Most of the merchant ships or the ships that you want to attack will immediately surrender, because every once in a while pirates would attack, and the stories of their horrific brutalities made for a good dose of reality for any merchant mariners who thought about opposing pirates and defending their ship rather than submitting. So it was a very common practice, going well back to the 1500s even, for ships to have on board a collection of flags that they could use under different circumstances to lull somebody else into a false sense of security.
Just kind of a follow-up to that. The kind of a joke at the bar. Two pirate ships are facing each other, both with French flags, and then they both put up the Jolly Roger at the last minute. What, in regards to the pirate code, I'm sure pirates would attack other pirates. There was no friendliness there, but if you could talk about that aspect.
Actually, there was a little bit of a, brethren of the coast mentality. Pirates, I found no records of pirates attacking each other. There may be some cases of that. Sometimes different pirate crews would even gang up and attack a couple of merchant ships. But the pirates didn't want to attack other pirates because they were well defended. They had no idea what was on board, and there were plenty of other potential victims on the horizon that they could attack. But I don't know of any account during the Golden Age where two pirate ships came up against each other and had an all-out fight.
Can you explain more about the letters of marque? So I'm assuming a letter of marque would come from a colonial governor,
Right.
but then you'd have England would be mad because they'd be sending out their navy to go counteract the letter of marque from the colonies. This was happening frequently, or?
No, well, the colonies were part of England at the
Right.
time, so the colonial governors or the mother country would give out a letter of marque during time of war that would give an armed merchant ship the legal license to attack ships that were enemies. Like if you're England and France, and you're against, you're fighting France, the letter of marque would give you permission to attack French ships, bring them back, get some of the profits. Some of the profits would go to the government. So colonial governors could also issue letters of marque. It was called license. It was almost like license piracy. And the skills of a privateer are very often the same skills as a pirate. So sometimes privateers slowly merged into pirates, but there is a legal distinction, and privateers during times of war were doing something that was quote-unquote legal. They were amplifying the power of that country's navy on the ocean, whereas pirates would attack ships of any nation, by and large, and they had no formal document from any government authority that gave them permission to do so. So that's the distinction between the two.
So were the Red Seamen kind of privateers that sort of went rogue? Or?
No, they knew that they were going to go rogue. They were given privateering licenses so that they were stopped during their journey. They could show the privateering licenses and appear nothing but a legally licensed privateer. Once they got into the Indian Ocean, they were attacking Mughal ships. England was not at war with the Mughal Empire.
Sure.
So that was out and out piracy. And the privateering licenses were sort of given as a dubious cover to their activities.
Okay, that makes sense.
So-
Thanks.
I'm sure there are humorous questions about pirates. For example, what do you call a pirate with 2 arms, 2 legs, and 2 eyes?
I don't know.
That's the beginner pirate. But
Okay. There are a lot of pirate jokes. Unfortunately, since this presentation is being filmed, I wasn't able. No, I don't have a bawdy joke that I would tell that anyway. But for my other presentation, I use 6 New Yorker cartoons about pirates, but I can't use them when I'm being filmed. But they're really funny. They're sort of subtle jokes. But there are a lot of pirate jokes. I haven't heard too many. Not too many people at my talks have offered them up, but I know there are plenty out there. I've certainly got a number of args and hey matey and shiver me timbers and all that kind of stuff. But
I'm just curious if the modern pirates today, the ones, particularly I'm referring to the ones mainly off the East African coast in the Arabian Sea, this sort of area, have adapted tactics from the old days that seem to have been successful, and how they implemented them, to your knowledge, if you read about some of the more recent cases, particularly the one about there was a American, I think, or a Westerner who was caught, and they put him into that, I forgot, that vestibule, and he was actually rescued. Right, exactly,
Okay.
a couple of years ago.
yeah, I don't think the tactics, I mean, in the sense of plundering another ship, they're not really plundering the ship, they're taking over the ship
Right.
using semi-automatic weapons, so it's quite different. There are many of the same, there are some parallels. One, the pirates of today, Somali pirates, and the ones off Venezuela, which were causing a real problem this past summer,
Right.
in some instances are quite barbaric and have killed some of their victims. Also, piracy back in the Golden Age was somewhat propelled by economic circumstances, and Venezuela and Somalia are certainly 2 countries that are in economic freefall, and some people have chosen piracy as a way to climb out of that. But there are pirates in the Malacca Strait, in the Far East, they're all over. As long as people go to sea, there will be pirates. But in terms of using the same tactics, I think it's a little bit different when you're in a Boston whaler with a machine gun mounted to your
Yeah,
bow
right, of course.
than it was back then when you're in a sailing ship and had cannons that were a little more difficult to hit your mark,
Right.
and also you had different ways to advertise your intentions. But, so there's some similarities, but there are a lot of differences.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you again for coming. Thanks.
Folks, there will be a book signing 1 level up in the Archives bookstore. We will meet you there in a few moments. Books are at the cash register.